When I announced I was moving to Arizona, my family didn't care. 10 months later, they suddenly did. The words hung in the air like a bad joke no one laughed at, my voice cracking just a little as I set down my coffee mug on the cluttered kitchen table, the one we'd bought from IKEA years ago when we thought a bigger surface would mean more family dinners, but now it was just a graveyard for half-eaten takeout containers and Alex's forgotten homework sheets. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring, the kind where the rain tapped insistently against the windows of our suburban split level in New Jersey, the living room lamp casting a warm but unforgiving glow on Emily's face as she scrolled through her phone, her thumb flicking upward in that absent way she had lately, and Alex, our 12-year-old, slouched on the couch with his headphones on, probably blasting some video game soundtrack while he pretended to study for his math test tomorrow. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head a dozen times during the drive home from work, the traffic on the turnpike giving me plenty of time to stew over the email from my old college buddy in Phoenix offering me that project manager job at his solar energy firm, a chance to start fresh in a place where the sun didn't hide behind gray clouds for months on end. But really, it was more than that. It was the culmination of feeling like a ghost in my own home. The way Emily's responses to my stories about the office had dwindled to nods and mm-hms over the last couple of years, how Alex's hugs had turned into shrugs, and how our weekends blurred into Netflix binges where no one really talked anymore. So I cleared my throat and said it. I've been offered a job in Arizona and I'm thinking of taking it. Moving there, I mean. Watching their faces for the shock, the pleas, the sudden realization that I mattered, but Emily just glanced up briefly, her eyes tired from her own long day at the hospital as a nurse, and muttered, "Arizona? That's hot, isn't it? Pass the remote, hun," before turning back to her screen. And Alex didn't even pull off his headphones, just gave a half wave like I was interrupting his level up, mumbling something about needing more screen time for his project. The silence after that was thicker than the steam from my cooling coffee, and I stood there, my heart pounding in a way that felt both furious and hollow, like I'd just confessed to an affair or a crime. But instead, it was this, my attempt to jolt us out of the complacency that had settled over our marriage like dust on the bookshelves I never got around to cleaning. I remember thinking, is this it? 15 years of marriage? The mortgage payments, the parent-teacher conferences, the rushed mornings where I'd make Alex's lunch with turkey sandwiches he barely ate, and Emily's quick pecks on the cheek before she dashed out the door. All boiling down to this indifference? As if I were announcing I was switching brands of toothpaste. The pain hit me then, raw and unexpected. A grief for the family we'd been. The one where Emily used to leave notes in my briefcase, and Alex would draw pictures of us as superheroes. But now it was this, a quiet erosion I hadn't named until that moment. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the linoleum, and excused myself to the garage, pretending I needed to check on the leaky roof we'd been ignoring. But really, I just sat on an old camping chair amid the boxes of holiday decorations, staring at my phone, wondering if I should text my sister about it, when knowing she'd say something practical, like talk it out, when all I wanted was to scream. Back inside, the evening dragged on in that tense, unspoken way. Emily finally asking if I wanted pizza for dinner, her voice casual, as if I hadn't just dropped a bomb, and me nodding, forcing a smile while we ate in front of the TV, some mindless sitcom playing that no one found funny. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, the space between us feeling like miles instead of inches, her breathing even and untroubled while I stared at the ceiling fan whirring above, I replayed their non-reactions. The way Emily's eyes had flicked back to her feed so quickly, Alex's shrug that said whatever without words, and the anger bubbled up, mixed with a deep, aching sadness that made my chest tight. Had I become so invisible, so taken for granted that leaving wouldn't even register? The fallout was immediate, but silent. I didn't sleep, my mind racing through logistics, the job offer's deadline, packing up my life into boxes, imagining a sparse apartment in the desert where the heat might burn away this numbness. By morning, as I poured cereal for Alex and kissed Emily goodbye, the routine felt like a betrayal, their obliviousness a knife twist, and I knew, in that raw dawn light filtering through the kitchen blinds, that this was the beginning of something fracturing, a pain I'd carry like a secret bruise, wondering if they'd ever notice I was gone, or if Arizona would just swallow me whole without a ripple in the life we'd built. That first full night after the announcement stretched into something unrecognizable, the house settling around us with the same creaks and sighs it always had, but now every sound felt accusatory, as if the walls themselves were disappointed in how quietly the fracture had begun. I stayed in the garage longer than necessary, scrolling through apartment listings in Tempe on my phone, the bright desert photos mocking the damp chill seeping through the concrete floor, until the pizza delivery guy rang the bell, and Emily called my name twice before I finally trudged back inside, wiping my hands on my jeans even though they weren't dirty. We ate in near silence on the couch, Alex between us like a buffer neither of us had asked for, his eyes glued to the television where some animated series played on mute because Emily had turned the volume down without asking, and when he reached for another slice, I noticed how his fingernails were bitten to the quick again, a habit he'd kicked years ago that had crept back without me realizing. After he finished and disappeared upstairs to brush his teeth, muttering a quick night that landed somewhere between us, I cleared the boxes, the cardboard edges soft from grease, and stacked them by the sink while Emily loaded the dishwasher with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd long since stopped expecting conversation. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would force her to look at me the way she used to when we fought over stupid things like whose turn it was to take out the trash. But the words stuck, heavy with the fear that if I opened my mouth, the hurt would spill out ugly and irreversible. Instead, I asked, too quietly, "You really don't care if I go?" And she paused, sponge dripping in her hand, then answered without turning around. "It's your career, right? If it's a good move, you should take it." Her voice flat, practiced, the same tone she used when reassuring patients that the pain would pass. I felt the sting of it, like a slap made of cotton, soft enough to dismiss, but hard enough to bruise. And I stood there, watching the back of her head, the way her hair was escaping the loose ponytail she always wore after shifts, strands curling against the nape of her neck where I used to kiss her good morning. She finished rinsing a plate, set it in the rack, and finally faced me, arms crossed, eyes wary rather than angry, and said, "We've both been drifting. Maybe some space isn't the worst thing." And the admission landed between us like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading but no splash. I nodded, because what else was there to do, then went upstairs to check on Alex, who was already under the covers with his tablet glowing blue against his face, earbuds in, pretending he hadn't heard us downstairs. I sat on the edge of his bed, and he didn't look up right away, but when he did, his expression was careful, guarded in a way no 12-year-old should have mastered yet. And he asked, "Are you actually leaving?" His voice small enough that I had to lean closer. I told him I hadn't decided, which was half true, the other half buried under layers of resentment and exhaustion, and he just shrugged, said, "Okay," and rolled over, pulling the blanket higher like that could end the conversation. Back in our bedroom, Emily was already in bed, reading something on her Kindle, the soft light catching the faint lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when we met. I changed into sweats in the bathroom, brushed my teeth staring at my reflection and hating how tired I looked, how ordinary, then slid under the covers on my side, keeping the distance we'd both grown accustomed to. She turned off the light without a goodnight, and in the dark, the space between us felt charged, not with desire, but with everything unsaid, years of small silences compounding until they became this chasm. I lay awake, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, while my own thoughts churned. The way she'd said drifting, like it was mutual, like I had been the one trying to row us back toward shore while she let the current carry her elsewhere. Guilt crept in then, insidious, because part of me knew I'd contributed to the distance too, working late, checking emails during dinner, assuming she'd always be there when I finally looked up. But the larger part burned with the unfairness of her calm acceptance, as if my leaving were just another logistical detail to schedule around soccer practice and grocery runs. Tears came quietly, hot and useless against the pillow, and I pressed my fist to my mouth so she wouldn't hear. Sometime after midnight, I slipped out of bed, grabbed the throw blanket from the chair, and went down to the living room couch where the cushions still smelled faintly of pizza and the rain had picked up again, drumming steadily against the roof. I curled up under the blanket, phone screen dimmed, rereading the job offer email until the words blurred, telling myself this was temporary, a pause, not an ending, even as the ache in my chest insisted otherwise. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by half-dreams of empty rooms and Alex's shrug replaying like a loop, and when morning finally arrived, gray light leaking through the blinds, I stayed there a long minute longer, listening to the house wake up without me. Emily's footsteps overhead heading to the shower, Alex's door creaking open, the ordinary sounds of a family that had somehow learned to function around the hole I was already beginning to leave. The next few days blurred into a careful choreography of avoidance and necessity, the house no longer a refuge but a stage where we all performed our roles with practiced restraint, every interaction measured to prevent collapse. I woke before the alarm most mornings, made coffee in the dim kitchen light while the rain continued its monotonous patter outside, the same storm system that had lingered since my announcement, refusing to move on, much like the tension that had settled between Emily and me. I packed Alex's lunch, apple slices he'd probably trade away, a turkey wrap with extra mustard the way he used to like it, while he shuffled downstairs in his hoodie, I still heavy with sleep, and when I handed him the brown paper bag he took it without looking up, mumbling thanks before grabbing his backpack and heading for the door where the school bus idled at the curb. I watched him climb the steps, the yellow bulk of the bus swallowing him whole, and felt the first sharp pang of protectiveness mixed with something darker, a fear that if I left he'd learn too early that people you love can just disappear into another state without much fanfare. Emily came down 10 minutes later, scrubs already on, hair pulled back, and we exchanged the bare minimum. Need anything from the store later? No, I'm good. Before she kissed the top of my head in a gesture so automatic it almost hurt more than indifference would have. She didn't ask about the job, didn't press for details about when I might go or what the apartment search looked like, and I didn't offer, both of us clinging to the fiction that silence was kinder than confrontation. But the real work of protection began that afternoon when Alex came home earlier than usual, the bus dropping him off while I was still sorting her emails at the dining table, and instead of heading straight to his room, he lingered in the doorway, backpack still slung over one shoulder, and asked quietly, "Are you and Mom fighting because of Arizona?" The question landed like a stone in my stomach, and I set my laptop aside, motioned for him to sit, noticing how small he looked against the oversized chair we'd bought when he was 8 and still growing into everything. I told him the truth as gently as I could. No, we weren't fighting, not exactly, but things had been hard between us for a while. Grown-up stuff that had nothing to do with him being good or bad or anything he'd done. He listened with that solemn nod he gave when he was trying to understand something too big, then said, "If you move, will I still see you?" And the simplicity of it cracked something open in me, tears pricking fast and hot. I promised him yes, video calls every night if he wanted, visits whenever school breaks allowed, summers in the desert where we could hike actual mountains instead of the flat trails at the county park. He didn't cry, just traced the wood grain on the table with his finger and asked if he could keep his room the way it was, posters and all, even if I wasn't here. And I said of course, it would always be his. After he went upstairs to change, I sat there a long time, the house quiet except for the refrigerator's low hum, feeling the weight of what I was asking him to carry, a divided life, 2 addresses, 2 versions of normal, and the guilt settled deeper, not just for considering leaving, but for letting the drift get this far before I named it. That evening, Emily and I finally talked, not in the living room where Alex might overhear, but out on the back porch after he'd gone to bed, the rain finally easing into a drizzle that made the deckboard slick under our socks. We sat on the old Adirondack chairs, mugs of tea cooling between our hands, and I told her I needed boundaries if this was going to happen. Full transparency about money, no surprises about custody arrangements, regular check-ins about Alex so he didn't feel like he was being shuttled between parents who couldn't stand to be in the same room. She listened without interrupting, staring out at the wet backyard where the swing set stood unused, rust creeping along the chains, then said softly, "I didn't realize how much you were hurting until you said you were leaving," and the admission felt like the first real crack in her armor. Not anger or defense, but something closer to regret. I asked why she hadn't fought it, why the shrug, and she took a slow breath, admitted she'd been scared. Scared of another fight that went nowhere, scared that if she begged you to stay, you'd resent her for holding you back from something better. Scared most of all that maybe we've both been unhappy for so long that staying together had become the habit, not the choice. We didn't solve anything that night, didn't fall into each other's arms or promise forever, but we set the first fragile rules. I'd delay the final decision 2 weeks, give us time to talk more, she'd stop retreating into her phone when I was home, and we'd both try to be present for Alex, no matter what came next. When we went back inside, the house felt fractionally less cold, the hallway light softer, and though I still slept on the couch, neither of us ready to share the bed yet, the silence between us had shifted from hostile to tentative, like 2 people learning very slowly how to speak the same language again after years of speaking past each other. The 2-week grace period I'd asked for felt both too long and too short. A limbo where every day carried the weight of decision without the relief of finality. And by the end of the first week, the house had grown claustrophobic. The same rooms we'd lived in for 15 years suddenly too small to contain the unspoken questions hanging between us. I needed air that didn't smell of the same coffee grounds and laundry detergent. So on Friday, after work, I told Emily I was going to my sister Claire's place in Connecticut for the weekend. Nothing dramatic, just a couple of nights to think, to breathe. And she nodded without argument, only asked if I'd be back in time for Alex's soccer game on Sunday. Her voice careful, almost polite, like we were colleagues negotiating schedules. I packed a small duffel with enough for 3 days, kissed Alex goodbye while he was doing homework at the kitchen table, promising I'd text him pictures of whatever weird roadside food I found on the drive, and he gave me a quick hug that lingered a second longer than usual, his chin pressing against my shoulder before he pulled away and said, "Don't forget to charge your phone." The practical reminder so like him it almost made me laugh through the ache. The drive up the turnpike was quiet, except for the low hum of talk radio I barely listened to, my mind replaying fragments of the porch conversation, Emily's admission that she'd been scared, my own realization that I'd stopped trying to bridge the gap because it felt safer to drift. And by the time I pulled into Claire's gravel driveway, the sky had cleared for the first time in weeks, stars sharp against the black, the kind of night that made the suburbs feel less suffocating. Claire met me at the door with a glass of red wine already poured. No questions at first, just a hug that smelled of her lavender shampoo and the faint trace of whatever she'd cooked for dinner. We sat on her screened porch overlooking the dark shapes of trees, the night air cool enough for a throw blanket, and after the second glass, I finally told her everything. Not just the announcement and the shrugs, but the slow bleed of connection over years. How I'd convinced myself the job in Arizona was about career, when really it was about escape, about testing whether anyone would notice if I stopped being the background noise in their lives. Claire listened the way only a sister can, without interrupting to fix or judge, then said quietly, "You're not invisible, you're just exhausted, and so is she." And the simplicity of it hit harder than any lecture could have. We talked late, circling the same questions. Could space heal what proximity had worn down? Was leaving the only way to force change? Or was it just running? And by the time we went inside to sleep on her pull-out couch, I felt lighter. Not resolved, but at least unburdened enough to name what I needed. Rules that would make any move, if it happened, less like abandonment and more like a painful but honest reorganization. Saturday morning, I woke to the smell of bacon and coffee, Claire already at the stove, and over breakfast, we mapped out the practicalities on her yellow legal pad, shared Google Calendar for Alex's schedule so neither of us missed a game or concert, a joint bank account for kid expenses that stayed untouched for personal stuff, monthly video calls between the three of us so Alex always saw both parents in the same frame, even if it was through screens. I added one more, full access to each other's phones and emails for the next 6 months. No secrets, no deleted messages, a transparency that felt invasive but necessary after years of polite distance. Claire raised an eyebrow at that one, but didn't argue, just said, if you're both willing to do that, maybe there's still something worth saving. I texted Emily the list mid-morning, keeping it factual, no accusations, just, these are the boundaries I think we need if I go, or even if I stay. And her reply came after a long pause. Okay, send me the doc. We can talk when they're back. No defensiveness, no pushback, just acceptance that felt like the smallest opening, a door cracked instead of slammed. The rest of the weekend passed in quiet domesticity, helping Claire prune her overgrown hydrangeas, walking the neighborhood loop where kids on bikes darted past, eating takeout Thai on her couch while we watched an old sitcom neither of us had seen in years. And each normal moment reminded me how much I still wanted ordinary life, just not the version that had turned hollow. Driving home Sunday afternoon, the sky was overcast again, but the rain held off, and when I pulled into our driveway, Alex was waiting on the front steps in his cleats, hair damp from an earlier shower, and the sight of him, grinning because they'd won the game 3-1, made my throat close. Emily stood behind him in the doorway, arms folded, but not closed off, and when I got out of the car, she met my eyes over his head and said simply, "We saved you a plate from the team pizza party," her voice steady, almost warm. I carried my bag inside, set it by the stairs instead of taking it straight to the bedroom, and for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. We ate leftovers at the kitchen table, Alex recounting every goal in exaggerated detail, and though Emily and I didn't touch or linger in conversation after he went to bed, the silence was softer, threaded with the possibility that space hadn't pushed us further apart, but had given us room to see each other clearly again, if only for a moment. The decision to stay hung in the air like humidity after a storm, unsettling, heavy, but not quite suffocating anymore. And when the 2 weeks ended, I sent a polite email to my friend in Phoenix thanking him for the offer, explaining that family circumstances had shifted and I needed to remain in New Jersey for the foreseeable future, hitting send with a mixture of relief and quiet terror that I might have just traded one kind of stagnation for another. Emily read the draft over my shoulder before I pressed the button, her hand resting lightly on my upper back for the first time in months. Not a full embrace, but enough contact that I felt the warmth of her palm through my shirt, and she murmured, "Thank you," so softly I almost missed it, the words carrying more weight than any long speech could have. We didn't celebrate, didn't pop champagne or make grand declarations, but the next morning she set the coffee maker to brew both our usual blends instead of just hers, a small ritual reclaimed. And when Alex came down for breakfast, he noticed immediately, tilting his head at the 2 mugs waiting on the counter and asking, "You're not going anymore?" I told him no, not right now, maybe never, and he gave a quick nod, then surprised us both by wrapping his arms around my waist in a hug that squeezed the air out of my lungs before he grabbed his cereal and sat at the table like nothing momentous had happened. The ordinary days resumed their rhythm. School drop-offs, grocery runs where we actually walked the aisles together instead of texting lists, evenings where the television stayed off longer while we talked about nothing and everything. But beneath the surface, the drift had left scars, trust eroded in tiny, cumulative ways, and I knew patching it would take more than shared chores and polite conversations. I booked my first individual therapy session the following week, a virtual appointment with a woman named Dr. Patel, whose profile photo showed a calm smile and whose intake form asked questions that made me squirm. When did you last feel truly seen by your partner? What are you most afraid of losing? And during that initial 50 minutes, I sat in the guest room with the door closed, laptop on my lap, voice low so no one downstairs would hear me admit how invisible I'd felt, how the shrugs and silences had accumulated until leaving seemed the only way to prove I existed. Dr. Patel listened without filling the pauses, then gently pointed out that my impulse to move across the country had been less about the job and more about forcing a reaction, any reaction, from the people I loved most. And hearing it spoken aloud felt like someone finally naming the bruise I'd been pressing on for years. I cried then, quietly, wiping my eyes with the sleeve of my hoodie, and when the session ended, I stayed seated a long minute, breathing through the rawness, surprised to find the house still standing when I opened the door. Emily started her own therapy a week later, separate from mine at first because we both needed space to untangle our own knots before trying to weave them together again. And though she didn't share details, she came home from her first appointment lighter in the shoulders, humming a little while she chopped vegetables for dinner. And when I asked how it went, she said simply, "It was hard, good hard," and left it at that. The small vulnerability acts began almost without planning, me leaving my phone face up on the counter instead of turning it over when a notification pinged, her telling me about a tough shift at the hospital without me having to prompt, the two of us sitting on the couch after Alex was in bed with a foot of space between us, but no phones in hand, just quiet talk about the day that sometimes veered into harder territory, how long she'd felt like she was carrying the emotional load alone while I buried myself in work, how I'd interpreted her exhaustion as rejection instead of shared fatigue. One night, maybe 3 weeks into therapy, I reached across that foot of space and covered her hand with mine, not expecting anything, just testing if the touch still felt possible, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her palm up, laced our fingers together, and we sat like that through the end of whatever show was playing in the background, neither of us speaking, the contact saying what words still couldn't quite manage. Tentative contact grew in other ways, too. Good morning texts that weren't just logistical, don't forget Alex has band practice, but actual check-ins, thinking about you today. A quick shoulder squeeze in the kitchen while she stirred pasta sauce, me bringing her coffee to the bedroom on a Saturday when she had the rare day off. Alex noticed the shift without us explaining it, started lingering at the dinner table longer, asking questions about our days instead of retreating to his room right after eating, and one evening he even suggested we all watch a movie together, picking an old family favorite we hadn't seen since he was little, and when the credits rolled, he leaned against my side on the couch, Emily's head resting on my other shoulder, the three of us fitting together in a way that felt both familiar and fragile, like a chair we'd repaired but still tested carefully before sitting. I wasn't naive enough to think the work was done. The anger still flared sometimes when old patterns surfaced. The grief over lost time still woke me at 3 a.m. But these small, deliberate acts were building something new, a cautious bridge constructed plank by plank. And for the first time in years, I let myself hope that the crossing might not be impossible after all. Part 6. The first joint therapy session arrived on a Thursday evening in late June, the kind of humid night where the air conditioner struggled against the sticky heat seeping through the windows, and we drove to Dr. Patel's office in separate cars because Emily had a late shift that ran long, and I needed the extra 20 minutes alone to steady my breathing. I arrived first, sat in the waiting room with its neutral beige walls and the faint scent of lavender diffuser, flipping through an old magazine without reading a word, my pulse loud in my ears as if this were a first date instead of an attempt to salvage what remained of a 15-year marriage. When Emily walked in, she looked flushed from the rush, scrubs swapped for jeans and a soft gray sweater, hair still damp from a quick shower at the hospital, and she gave me a small, nervous smile before sitting 2 chairs away, respecting the invisible boundary we'd both carried into this room. Dr. Patel greeted us quietly, ushered us into her office where 3 armchairs formed a loose triangle instead of the expected couch, and after the initial pleasantries, she asked us each to name one thing we hoped to get from these sessions together. No grand fixes, just one honest goal. I went first, voice rougher than I intended, and said I wanted to understand why the distance had grown so wide without either of us sounding the alarm sooner. And Emily, after a long pause, added that she hoped we could learn to speak our fears out loud before they turned into assumptions that hardened into walls. The simplicity of it disarmed me, and when Dr. Patel invited us to name the deeper issues that had brought us here, the room filled with a silence thick enough to taste, broken only by the low hum of the air vent overhead. I started with the resentment I'd nursed over years of feeling like the default parrot for the mundane, the laundry, the permission slips, the midnight stomach flu cleanups, while Emily carried the heavier emotional labor of listening to everyone else's pain at work, but rarely sharing her own at home. She listened without interrupting, then spoke of her own buried anger, how she'd felt like she was failing as a wife because she came home too tired to be present, how my late nights at the office had started feeling like deliberate absence, how she'd stopped asking for help because the rejections, however gentle, had begun to feel like proof she wasn't worth the effort. The words landed between us like stones we'd both been carrying, and hearing them spoken without accusation or defense made my chest ache in a new way, not with fresh hurt, but with the recognition of how much we'd each suffered in parallel, alone. Dr. Patel guided us through naming patterns rather than blaming each other, the way withdrawal had become our default response to stress, the slow starvation of small daily affections until touch felt risky, the habit of assuming the other's silence meant indifference instead of exhaustion, and by the end of the hour we were both raw, eyes red but not quite crying, the air in the room somehow lighter for having been disturbed. She suggested a small homework assignment. Over the next week, one deliberate act of vulnerability each day. Nothing huge, just something that required us to show up without armor. And we left with a shared Google Doc to log them in, a quiet accountability that felt both childish and necessary. The first few days were awkward, me leaving a post-it note on the bathroom mirror that read, "I missed hearing about your day yesterday. Tell me tonight." And her replying with a voice memo on my phone while I was stuck in traffic, her voice soft, recounting a patient who'd thanked her in halting English and how it had reminded her why she still did the job despite the burnout. By midweek, the axe grew slightly bolder. I reached for her hand while we watched Alex's virtual band concert on the laptop in the living room, our fingers threading together naturally this time, no hesitation, and she squeezed back once, twice, before letting go when the song ended. One evening, after he'd gone to bed, we sat at the kitchen table with the lights low, no phones, and talked about the future. Not dramatic promises, but small, concrete pictures. Maybe a weekend away, just the 2 of us next spring. Maybe couples dance lessons, because neither of us had ever learned, and the idea made us both laugh in that surprised, relieved way. The physical closeness followed slowly, almost shyly. A longer hug in the hallway when I got home from work, her head resting against my chest for a full breath before she pulled back. One night, lying in our bed for the first time since the announcement, the space between us narrowed to inches instead of feet. And when I turned toward her in the dark, she didn't roll away. I traced the line of her shoulder with my fingertips, tentative, asking without words, and she shifted closer, her hand finding mine under the sheet, palm to palm, fingers interlocking like puzzle pieces that had been missing for too long. We didn't make love that night, too much history still hovered, but we stayed like that, breathing in rhythm, the quiet act of holding on feeling more intimate than anything we'd done in years. In the morning, Alex found us still tangled together when he came in to ask about breakfast, paused in the doorway with wide eyes, then grinned and said, "Finally," before darting downstairs, leaving us both flushed and laughing softly into the pillows. The steps were small, the progress uneven. Some days old silences crept back, some nights one of us slept facing the wall, but each tentative bridge built in that room with Dr. Patel, each deliberate vulnerability shared at home, was stacking into something sturdier, a foundation we were both choosing, day by careful day, to stand on together again. Summer break arrived the last week of June like a sudden exhale after holding our breath for months, the school calendar granting us 3 unbroken weeks that felt both like a gift and a test. And when Emily suggested we take the family to the Poconos, renting a small cabin on a lake we'd visited once when Alex was 6, before the drift had fully set in, I agreed without hesitation. The idea of 4 walls that weren't our own, carrying the promise of reset, without the pressure of everyday routines. We packed the car on a Friday evening after work, Alex bouncing between the backseat and the garage with sleeping bags and board games he hadn't touched in years, Emily folding towels into neat stacks while I loaded the cooler with sandwiches, fruit, and the iced tea she still made from scratch the way her mother used to. And when we pulled out of the driveway, the sky was streaked with pink and gold, the first clear sunset in what felt like forever. The drive took just over 2 hours, windows cracked to let in the warm night air scented with pine as we left the turnpike for narrower roads, Alex chattering from the back about the fishing he planned to do, even though he'd never caught anything bigger than a sunfish. And Emily and I exchanged glances in the rearview mirror, small, private smiles that carried no weight of expectation, but felt like shared language again. The cabin was modest, cedar-sided with a wide front porch overlooking the water, screen door that slapped shut behind us as we carried bags inside, the smell of wood smoke and lake damp welcoming us like an old friend. We spent the first evening unpacking slowly, no rush, Alex claiming the top bunk in the loft, while Emily and I took the downstairs bedroom with its quilted bedspread and a window that framed the moon on the water. Dinner was simple. Grilled burgers on the charcoal pit outside, corn on the cob charred just right, paper plates balanced on our knees as we sat on Adirondack chairs watching fireflies blink across the lawn. And when Alex asked if we could build a fire later, Emily said yes, without checking her phone or glancing at the time, the 3 of us gathering kindling while the sky darkened to velvet. Around the small ring of stones, we roasted marshmallows, Alex burning his on purpose to make s'mores gooey, laughing when chocolate smeared his chin, and I caught Emily watching him with that soft, unguarded look she used to wear more often. Then she turned it on me, her eyes reflecting the flames, and for a heartbeat, the years fell away. The days unfolded in gentle rhythm, morning swims in water still cool from the night, Alex cannonballing off the dock while Emily and I floated on our backs, hands occasionally brushing underwater in silent acknowledgement. Afternoons were lazy, reading on the porch or playing cards at the picnic table, losing track of time until hunger pulled us inside to make sandwiches or heat up leftovers. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, dark clouds boiling over the lake, and we raced inside just as the rain started, fat drops drumming on the metal roof while lightning forked across the sky. Alex pressed against the window, counting seconds between flash and thunder, then curled up between us on the couch with a blanket, the 3 of us watching the storm like it was a movie, his head eventually heavy on my shoulder, Emily's fingers tracing slow circles on my knee. When the power flickered out, we lit candles, played flashlight tag through the small rooms until Alex declared himself king of the dark and collapsed giggling on the rug. Later, after he'd fallen asleep upstairs, Emily and I sat on the porch swing under the clearing stars, rain still dripping from the eaves, and the quiet stretched comfortable instead of tense. I told her about the nights I'd lain awake wondering if she'd ever look at me the way she used to, and she admitted she'd spent just as many nights convinced I was already gone in spirit, that staying was easier than risking the truth. The words didn't sting this time. They landed soft, like admissions long overdue, and when she leaned her head against my shoulder, I wrapped an arm around her, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing match mine. We stayed like that until the air cooled, then went inside to the bedroom where the candle still burned low on the dresser. Undressing felt deliberate. No hurry, just the quiet rustle of clothes and the knowledge that this time, touch carried no obligation, only choice. When we came together, it was slow, careful, almost reverent, hands mapping familiar territory that had grown unfamiliar, mouths finding old paths and new ones, bodies remembering what words had struggled to say. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, her head on my chest, my fingers in her hair, and she whispered against my skin, "I'm glad we didn't lose this." The simple sentence cracking open the last of the walls we'd both built. The rest of the trip passed in that same gentle key. Hikes along pine needle trails where Alex collected smooth stones for his windowsill, paddle them rides that left us all laughing at how badly we steered, quiet evenings where conversation flowed without effort. The final morning, packing up felt bittersweet, the cabin already missing us as we loaded the car. But when Alex hugged the porch railing goodbye and said, "Can we come back next summer?" Emily and I answered yes at the same time, our voices overlapping in perfect sync. The drive home was quieter, content, Alex eventually dozing in the back while Emily hand rested on my thigh, thumb moving in lazy arcs. And I realized forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but this accumulation of small, chosen closenesses, each one stitching the torn places stronger than before. We arrived home as the sun set, the familiar suburban street looking different somehow, less like a cage, more like a place we'd chosen to return to, scars and all, ready to keep building on the foundation the lake had helped us remember was still there. A year to the day after I first spoke the words about Arizona in our cluttered kitchen, the calendar on the fridge still showed the same faded photo of the three of us at the lake cabin last summer, edges curling from humidity, and I stood at the counter pouring coffee into the same chipped mugs we'd used every morning since we bought the house, the routine now carrying a quiet gratitude instead of obligation. The rain that had defined so much of that spring had long since given way to ordinary seasons, crisp autumns where leaves blanketed the lawn, winters with snow that turned the street into something almost magical, springs that brought crocuses pushing through the mulch we'd finally spread together, and through each one, the small, deliberate choices had accumulated into something solid. Not perfect, but unmistakably changed. Alex was 13 now, taller than I'd expected him to be at this point, voice cracking occasionally when he got excited about a new video game or a school project on renewable energy that had him sketching solar panels late into the night. And though he still rolled his eyes at our attempts at family game nights, he showed up anyway, sprawled on the living room rug with cards or a board between us, teasing Emily about her terrible poker face while she pretended to be offended. Therapy had tapered off to once-a-month check-ins for both of us separately and together, less about crisis and more about maintenance, the way you service a car that's running well but you know could skid if neglected. Dr. Patel had smiled during our last joint session and said we'd moved from survival to stewardship, and though the phrase felt a little clinical, it fit. The way we now scheduled intentional time, not out of desperation, but because we'd learned what happened when we didn't. Emily still worked long shifts at the hospital, came home sometimes with shadows under her eyes from a code that hadn't gone well, but now she talked about it over dinner instead of retreating to the shower first, letting Alex and me listen while she unloaded the weight in small, manageable pieces. I'd taken on a promotion at my local firm last fall, one that kept me closer to home with better hours, and the extra evenings had become ours, cooking together on Sundays, trying recipes from the internet that sometimes failed spectacularly, laughing over burnt edges while ordering takeout as backup. Physical closeness had settled into something natural again, not the hungry reclaiming of the cabin trip, but the steady comfort of habit restored. Her hand finding mine under the table during movies, my arm around her shoulders on the couch while Alex played Fortnite upstairs, the occasional slow dance in the kitchen when a good song came on the speaker, bodies remembering the rhythm without needing to think about it. Forgiveness hadn't arrived as a single thunderclap, but as a gradual thawing, moments when old hurts surfaced and we could name them without the conversation spiraling, me admitting I still sometimes braced for indifference when I shared something vulnerable, her confessing guilt over her own withdrawal lingered on quiet nights. We met those admissions with patience now, not defensiveness, and each time the bruise hurt a little less. Tonight, the anniversary unmarked on any calendar but etched in my mind, we sat at the kitchen table after Alex had gone to bed, the house quiet except for the low hum of the dishwasher and the occasional creak of settling beams. Emily reached across the table and turned my wedding ring with her thumb, the small gesture she'd started doing again this past year, and said softly, "I almost lost you without even realizing how close I was to letting go," her voice steady but thick with the memory. I covered her hand with mine and told her I'd almost walked away to prove I was worth noticing, that the real miracle wasn't that I stayed, but that we'd both chosen to look harder, to stay present even when it was easier not to. We didn't need to rehash every detail, the shrugs, the silences, the nights on the couch, because we'd already carried them through therapy and late-night talks and the slow rebuilding of trust. Instead, we sat with the quiet truth that the family we'd almost lost had been remade, not into something flawless, but into something more honest, more resilient. Scars remained, moments when one of us pulled back too quickly, when a casual comment landed wrong and required an apology, but they no longer defined us. They were just evidence we'd survived something hard and chosen to keep choosing each other. Later, we went upstairs together, brushed teeth side by side at the sink like we used to before life got loud, and slid under the covers where the space between us had long since disappeared. She curled against me, head on my chest, and I felt the steady beat of her heart syncing with mine in that old, familiar way. Outside the window, the streetlights glowed soft through the blinds, the neighborhood asleep, and for the first time in years, I fell asleep without a single what-if circling my mind. The bond we'd rebuilt wasn't unbreakable, nothing human is, but it was stronger for having been broken and mended, threaded through with the knowledge that love, when it's tended carefully, can weather even the longest silence. In the morning, Alex would bound downstairs demanding pancakes, Emily would groan about needing more coffee, and I would stand at the stove flipping batter while they bickered good-naturedly over syrup brands, the ordinary sounds of us filling the house like sunlight after a long storm, scarred but whole, quietly certain we'd keep showing up for whatever came next.